it's recording. See there.
Okay, what links is on?
Part 2, Wagar is going to talk about the ancient developments that changed human existence. My intro in the newsletter, I'm not sure you were going to talk about cooking. It just was an example that really stuck in my mind as something
That was last time.
interesting. That was last time. Yeah. So I didn't even know what's going to come up this time, but we all will. But we're about to find out. So go ahead, Al.
Okay, thank you. Well, for the first installment of all of this, I was about to leap into the Neolithic, and then we got into weaving, and I realized, oh, that started way back in the Paleolithic, so we sort of stepped back. But now we'll go ahead to the Neolithic. Well, with the Neolithic, and Neolithic essentially means new stone. Paleolithic means old stone, and there was quite an improvement in stone tools, but the real change was agriculture. And with agriculture came people living together. Not everyone had to be out scrambling for food, and so there were a lot of innovations, including writing and pottery, keep this going, wheel, sails and sailing, and the beginning use of metals. Food and agriculture were really critical, and I'll start there. Agriculture seems to have started in many different places fairly independently, and one expert has China, Southeastern Asia, India, Turkey, Iraq, Ethiopia, the Mediterranean, all those in the Old World. And then in the New World, Mesoamerica, Central America, and in the Andes. And I don't know if these spots are still in the Andes or in the rest of it. But by about 11,000 years ago, there were 8 founder crops evolving in the Mesopotamian area. And 3 of these were grasses, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, and barley. 4 were legumes, peas, lentils, bitter vetch, which I'd never heard of before, chickpeas, and then there was flax. And rice was domesticated in China about this time. About 5,000 years ago, people were already terracing mountainsides to grow food. The earliest evidence being in Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula. The emphasis on recognized crops kind of misses some earlier events. By about 23,000 years ago, there was evidence of people cultivating grasses for food, but they weren't yet domesticated in the varieties of wheat and so on. Like the use of fire, agriculture was really a major turning point in human development. It allowed all kinds of interesting things to develop, including writing. First writing apparently was on little tokens that were used in trading goods and so on. And then we could go for days talking about alphabets and how they evolved. But here's kind of a graph. The first, I think about 3,000 years ago, they call proto-synaptic. And then what we mostly learned was the first alphabet was the Phoenician. And this evolved into ancient Greek, ancient Latin, Roman, and now what we use currently. So there's been quite an evolution in just writing and alphabets. Writing became essential as more and more people lived together in settlements, and things got more complex. And this was especially true where there was irrigation, because it took somebody to coordinate all the irrigation. And this is probably depicting something along the ancient Nile. And interestingly, where they had irrigation, whoever controlled the water had real power, and it often became absolute power. A downside of agriculture was that people got smaller. They weren't eating as much meat, even though they had domesticated some animals, and they decreased by about a little bit over a half. as agriculture was developing, so were domesticated animals. The pig was domesticated about 11,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. And the piglets look fairly manageable, but I wouldn't want to tangle with Mama here. She looks pretty vicious. And it's very likely that domestication began by probably killing the adults during hunting and then capturing the young and perhaps keeping them penned up and so on. And in selecting, they seem to select for juvenile characteristics. So if anybody has a dog or had a dog, it probably didn't look much like a wolf. It looked more like a wolf puppy, perhaps. And so the domestication normally seemed to select for juvenile traits. But after the pig, there were goats and sheep. The ibex, or wild goat, was domesticated in a lot of places. And it moved out, spread very rapidly from various centers where they domesticated it. Apparently they were sharing their technology somehow. How do you do this? But the domestic goats don't look a whole lot like their wild ancestors. These are the sheep from which domestic sheep were domesticated. And they look very much like our bighorn sheep. But these are domestic sheep. It's a herd of adults, but they all look like lambs. As mentioned, it seemed to be advantageous to select for juvenile traits and also to kind of dumb them down so that they didn't have their own ideas about what to do. Cattle were domesticated from the Arctic in areas of modern Turkey and India, also about 11,000 years ago. And they became smaller and perhaps more juvenile, and led to just an unbelievable variety of breeds. So all kinds of different kinds of things. It was kind of a side issue and not very fitting to my timeline. I got wondering, where in the world did the longhorn come from? And it turns out it was in Spain. It was a cross between an Iberian breed and one from India. And the Spaniards brought them here in the early 1500s. And then most of them went wild for a couple of centuries and were almost extinct when some people from the Forest Service and other groups captured a few, mostly as a curiosity, and put them on the Wichita Wildlife Preserve in Oklahoma. They're said to be rather gentle, and I think if all your neighbors had long, pointy horns, it would pay to be polite. So, but interestingly, there are also longhorns in Africa, which kind of startled me. You notice that the horns are pointed up. These began in Egypt on the order of 5,000 years ago, called Egyptian or Hamitic longhorn cattle. And then they migrated sort of from the Nile area down into Ethiopia and down along eastern Africa. And some of you have been on safaris looking at lions and leopards and other predatory beasts. So maybe it's important that they had their horns turned upward instead of straight out like our longhorns here. So they were depicted in some of the ancient Egyptian relics about 5,000 years back. Well, the interesting thing about grazing animals, you know, they'll go out and forage on grasses and shrubs and so on, things that we can't eat, but turn them into useful products like milk and cheese, meat, and furthermore, they use their own energy to go out and feed and then bring the products back home, which is all pretty slick. But grazing also has a downside. If you look at the red soil, bare soil under these feral goats, overgrazing leads to real loss of productivity due to erosion. And George Perkins Marsh was a diplomat, assigned, U.S. diplomat, assigned to the Mediterranean. And in 1850, he noticed that the soils there had become much less productive due to forest clearing and grazing. And way earlier, about 2,000 years ago, the Roman poet Lucretius wrote this: "The earth once brought forth vineyards, shining harvests, pastures and orchards, and now with our utmost toil we wear down our strength, withering oxen or men to all the edges of our plowshares, and in return our fields turn mean and stingy, leaving us underfed." So even way back, they were beginning to notice, we've lost productivity somehow. They may not have known just what was going on, but probably grazing animals. But I'll move on to pottery. Pottery really began in the Neolithic, and although the earliest potsherds are from China about 20,000 years ago, all the other evidence is much more recent. Sub-Saharan Africa about 11,000 years ago, and the oldest pottery found in Europe is from Russia in the Volga region, about 8,700 years ago. At about the same time, pottery was evolving in the lower Amazon basin in South America. And then it migrated up around the northern part of the continent and down the western side and up into Mesoamerica. For North America, the earliest pottery found is about 4,800 years ago near Augusta, Georgia. And it later moved sort of west and north, the Mississippian mound builders into our American Southwest about 1,500 years ago. These are potsherds from the Augusta area. This is a Mississippian pot about 800 years ago, and a head pot, also Mississippian, from somewhere between 500 and 800 years ago. I'm going to skip the weaving and everything of our southwestern Indians, go right to their pottery. And it got to our southwest about 1,500 years ago, with Chaco Canyon being a particularly rich place in artifacts. And this bowl is 500, 800 years ago, already quite sophisticated with patterns and everything. Clay shrinks, most of it, when it dries, as in this probably light dry lake bed. And so they temper it. They put organic matter or sand, ground seashells, something else to keep it from shrinking as it dries. And the pots from Georgia were apparently tempered with Spanish moss, which is really a lichen. But because it was an organic material, they could carbon date it and find out, okay, when were these things created? Okay, we're going to wheels. The wheels did not begin with transportation. The first wheels were platforms, usually round, very hard to turn, but they were just platforms for making pottery. And they preceded wheels by a huge amount. The potter's wheel was invented 1,000 years after the turnettes. And, we're so used to wheels on cars and other things that we assume, no, somebody got the idea for potter's wheels from a cart. Well, no, carts didn't exist yet. The oldest evidence of a wheel used for transportation is about 5,000 years back. And the first wheels were usually cross sections of logs. I was in Chile in 1960, 61, and there were ox carts, still with wooden wheels from logs. Eventually, they began hollowing out the wheels to make them lighter, and eventually got to the spoked wheel. So on to sails and sailing. First sails were probably animal skins just held up to catch the wind, somebody on a raft or a boat. And here's a depiction of a log raft with a sail. Here's one with a person on it. If we disregard Asia, the earliest evidence for sails is from an Egyptian pot dated 5,000 years ago. And during Roman times, the square sail was standard for the Mediterranean and was good only for downwind sailing. And about 2,000 years ago, someone invented the lateen sail. Lateen, I guess, from Latin, but it was triangular. And with the square sail eventually led to our full-rigged ocean-going ships. But the lateen sail, with the wind, took a sort of an airfoil shape. And then there was a lift force generated from the wind coming in from the side. And you resolve that, and you get part of it in drift, which the keel would counteract. But you also got a component of forward motion. The lateen sail could sail within something like 75 degrees of where the wind was. And now more modern boats can go within 40, 45 degrees of that with sails. But now they're not even using sails. The advanced things are using airfoils. So you see the airfoil shape up here. And they're not even letting the hulls touch the water, they're riding up on foils, which is almost unbelievable. They're apparently easily achieving 45 knots or more. And I saw one claim of a boat going 65 miles an hour up on foils with wind power. So they can go faster than the speed of wind. So on to Asia. Here's a depiction of a Chinese junk. They began with square sails on a central mast. And about 2,000 years ago, they adopted what they called the junk sail, which apparently allowed some upwind capability. Back between 1400 and 1433, a bit ahead of Columbus and his 1492 voyage, the Chinese had a bunch of international tours with what they call treasure ships. And records aren't very agreeable, but some claim they were as long as a football field. They were big, and they sent out big fleets with thousands of men. There's some claim that they visited North America in 1421, not very well documented, treasure ship. But there are well documented records of their actual voyages where they went down southeastern Asia, this area up into India, Red Sea, even down the coast of Africa somewhat. They did them for a while, and then for some reason they quit. Well, at the same time the Polynesians were sailing, and they were sailing hugely, just unbelievable what they did. And it seems that they came out of Asia about 5,500 years ago, and by about 3,000 years ago, they had gotten to Samoa and Tonga. And then there was a great pause, about 2,000 years when they didn't do much sailing. And this may have been when they were sort of getting their act together with their big sailing canoes and navigation skills and so on. But then they started going out into the Eastern Pacific. And by 1,100 years ago, they had reached the Hawaiian Islands. By 800 years ago, they had reached New Zealand and Easter Island. And you know, the time is really fascinating. This was all 800 years ago. And you look at Columbus, that was just a little over 500 years ago. So 800 years ago, the Polynesians had much better understanding of the Pacific than the Europeans did of the Atlantic. Where they started to go to the East Indies, and they bumped into this landmass that turned out to be the Americas. Well, the sails of the seagoing canoes were made from the leaves of the pandanus tree. And if you look at the pattern of the sails, you see a woven pattern. The leaves of the pandanus tree are about 7 feet long. So you can imagine it was made pretty good sense to weave these into something like a fabric. We built replicas, and using the ancient navigation skills, traced some of the same voyages, but kind of cheated. They brought along a support ship in case of emergency. But they made some really interesting voyages. They seem to have changed the sail shape a little bit, perhaps for better upwind capability. Interestingly, they used the stars as a compass, and stars will set on the horizon or rise from the horizon at specific points that doesn't change with latitude or time of the year. And so the navigators would memorize these enough to have a whole compass rose. And there are no written records, so this all had to be stored in memory. And they probably passed the skills down generation after generation. So it probably took years to become an experienced navigator. They used various things. They used the stars, and they used the wave motion, because islands will not only block waves, but reflect waves. So a navigator could sometimes tell about where an island was by just the walking of the boat. Well, some birds fly out to sea to feed, quite distant, and then fly back to their nest. And so watching bird flight is also a good indicator of land. As mentioned, they got way into the whole Pacific about 800 years ago. Well, the more we learn, the less tidy things become, and they now found human footprints in New Mexico that are dated to about 23,000 years ago, just throwing into disarray the whole idea of how the people of the Americas got here. And so there were ancient peoples before we knew. Another interesting thing, that Jara Diamond made quite a thing of the collapse of people on Easter Island. And now they've gone back to the journals of some of the first Europeans and various archaeological stuff, and found, they were in pretty good shape when the Europeans first arrived. But for a while they were just outright slaughtered, and in the 1860s over 1,000 were taken as slaves. So they didn't collapse from overexploitation quite the way that Jara Diamond has it. It's a good cautionary tale, because with climate change we seem to be needing something to remind us, we can really mess things up. But unfortunately, he didn't pick a very good example. The Jubia palm, which was kind of the major source of wood, also went extinct. And they say, well, they just overexploited it. Well, it turns out that they had taken rats from earlier places, mostly as a food source. And the rats would double population about every 6 weeks with no predators, and the only predator were human beings. They couldn't keep up with it, so the population just exploded. And unfortunately, the rats ate almost all of the palm seed. So that's what really pushed the palm out of existence. So, we've gotten through sailing and rats and the Easter Islands, so if you have questions and comments, we'll go at it. And if somebody...
Oh, there's Marie in the microphone, maybe.
And I guess we can pass this one around.
Okay, I'll go get the other.
But I'm not aware of any use. The ivory, I guess, is in really solid things that you can shape and machine and so on.
A couple of things, I think, with regard to that. Elephant tusks are teeth.
Right.
And they are not horns, so it's an entirely different material.
Yeah.
I want to make a couple of comments, if it's okay, about domestication. One is, traditionally it's been thought that the dog was the first domesticant. and then food crop animals came after that. Another thing is, as I recall, from an archaeological perspective, the only way you can tell sheep from goats is by their horn core. So all the rest of the skeletal material, the bones are basically indistinguishable. So it used to be, when they talked about an archaeological site, it was sheep-goats because they couldn't be differentiated. And just one more thing, with regard to sheep and goats, when they graze, unlike cows, they pull plants up by the roots. And so when sheep and goats cover ground and graze, they basically destroy all the plants. They do not chew them off. They pull them up by the roots.
Yeah, good points. Thanks for the correction on teeth versus horns. You kind of overlooked that. On domestication, it's really fascinating. The dog, they think self-domesticated because wolves, like people, were hunting in packs, and it looks like the wolves would hang around camps because the weapons weren't adequate to do much about them. And very likely people threw bones and stuff at them, and the ones that were least fearful got the most food, reproduced. Some of you have probably seen the discussion of fox farms in Russia, where the foxes were just nasty, and they selected the youngsters for the most gentle, and after a few generations, they were like puppies, playful, and some of them began getting white spots. So, fascinating, the whole history of domestication and so on. I guess we're wound up. Thank you.